The plate hit the table with a crack that silenced the entire bunkhouse. Beatrice Archer stood at the head of that long, scarred table with her hands balled into fists at her sides, her dark eyes blazing with something that went far beyond fury. It was the look of a woman who had discovered a secret she was never supposed to find, and the weight of it was crushing the breath right out of her chest. "You knew," she said, her voice low and shaking. "You knew the entire time." Edgar Ashford did not flinch. He sat at the far end of the table with his hat pushed back on his head and his hands folded quiet and deliberate in front of him, the way a man sits when he has already decided how this confrontation is going to end. His blue eyes, pale as a winter sky above the Rio Grande, held hers without wavering. "Beatrice, do not," she said. "Do not say my name like that, like I am someone you have to manage." The two ranch hands who had still been lingering near the stove backed out through the door without a word. Because there are moments in this world that belong only to the people living them, and every man with a lick of sense knows to recognize one when he sees it. Beatrice pressed her knuckles against the table's surface and leaned forward. The lantern light caught the angles of her face, the high cheekbones, the set of her jaw, the trembling lips she was forcing still through sheer will alone. "The deed," she said. "The deed to my father's land. You had it. You have been holding it for 3 months, and you sat at my table every single night, eating food I made with my own hands, asking for seconds like you had not a care in this world, and you never once told me." Edgar's jaw tightened, just slightly. "It is more complicated than that," he said. "Then you had better start uncomplicating it," Beatrice said, "because in about 30 seconds I am going to walk out that door and you will never see the inside of this kitchen again." The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut enough to snap. Outside, the Texas wind moved through the mesquite trees and rattled the shutters, and a coyote called once from somewhere out in the dark chaparral. The lantern flame bent sideways and recovered. Edgar Ashford stood up from the table slowly. He was a tall man, lean through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered steadiness that comes not from easy living but from surviving things that should have broken a person. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and laid a folded paper document flat on the table between them. Beatrice stared at it. "It was not betrayal," he said quietly. "I swear to you it was not." She looked up at him then, and whatever she had expected to find in his face, it was not what she found. Because Edgar Ashford, the most self-contained man in Crockett County, Texas, looked like a man who was afraid. Not of her. Not of any consequence she might bring down on him. He looked afraid of losing something he had never quite allowed himself to name. And that was when Beatrice Archer, whose whole plan had been to cook for the Ashford Ranch through spring roundup and no longer, understood that something had happened to her over the course of those long, golden evenings at that stove. Something she had been trying very hard not to look at directly. She had to go back. She had to understand how they had arrived at this moment, this table, this devastating, illuminating night, because it had not started with deception. It had started, the way all the most dangerous things do, with something as simple as hunger. The year was 1882, and the town of Crockett Bend, Texas, sat at the edge of the Edwards Plateau like something the earth had pushed up without quite finishing. It had a church, 2 saloons, a general mercantile, a telegraph office, a livery, and a bone-dry main street that turned to brick-red mud the 3 times a year it rained properly. The cattle ranches spread out around it in all directions, their pastures divided by cedar post fences and creek lines, and the ancient, invisible agreements of men who had been working this land since before the war. Beatrice Archer had come to Crockett Bend in March of 1882, riding the Wells Fargo stage from San Antonio with a single trunk, a cast-iron skillet wrapped in her good wool skirt to keep it from rattling, and a heart that was working very hard to feel nothing in particular. She was 26 years old. She was not a widow, though people sometimes assumed she was because of the quiet, self-possessed way she carried herself. She had never been married. She had spent the last 4 years in San Antonio keeping house and cooking for her uncle's boarding house after her father's death had left her without options, and her uncle's invitation had been the only one forthcoming. She was not bitter about this. She had made herself useful, and useful felt better than helpless. But the boarding house had burned down in February. Her uncle had moved to live with his daughter in Galveston, and Beatrice had found herself with the address of her father's old land grant in Crockett County, a small amount of money, and the first real decision of her adult life sitting in front of her like an unexploded shell. Her father, Thomas Archer, had owned 40 acres outside Crockett Bend before his death. That land was supposed to be hers by right of inheritance. The county recorder's office in Crockett Bend held the deed, or so her uncle had told her, and settling the paperwork and determining what to do with the property was reason enough to make the journey. In the meantime, she needed income, and Beatrice Archer could cook. She could cook the way some people play music, with an instinctive, effortless command that made even simple things transcendent. Her biscuits were the kind that made men close their eyes. Her beef stew could make a hard afternoon feel like something worth having lived. Her dried apple pie was a subject of actual reverence among everyone who had ever eaten it, and in the Texas Hill Country in 1882, the ability to feed a working ranch crew well was worth more than most people thought to advertise. She heard about the Ashford Ranch within 2 days of arriving in town, because in a small community, news of a capable woman looking for temporary work travels with extraordinary efficiency. The Ashford cattle operation was the largest in the county. It ran 1,500 head, employed 12 permanent hands, and sat 12 miles outside town on a stretch of creek-fed grassland that was the envy of every neighboring rancher. Its owner, Edgar Ashford, was 32 years old, had inherited the place from his father 6 years prior, and had by all accounts run it with sober, relentless competence ever since. He was spoken of with respect and a kind of cautious warmth, the way people speak of someone they genuinely like, but are also a little wary of because his thoughts are not always easy to read. The ranch's cook had left the previous week. A man named Hoskins, who had been feeding the crew for 4 years, had departed for California to pursue what he described as an opportunity, and the crew had been eating whatever the youngest hand, a 17-year-old named Pete, could manage to produce, which was not much beyond boiled beans and burned bacon. Beatrice rode out to the Ashford Ranch on a borrowed horse on a Wednesday morning in the middle of March, having sent a note ahead through the mercantile owner's boy. She wore her good gray dress and her mother's brooch at the collar, and she did not allow herself to feel nervous, because nervousness was a luxury she had learned not to indulge. The ranch headquarters was a collection of solid, practical buildings clustered along a bend in Lone Creek, a main house of whitewashed limestone, a long bunkhouse, a cookhouse with a separate chimney, 2 large barns, a smokehouse, and a chicken run that suggested someone had once cared about domestic details. The whole place had the feeling of a working operation that was too busy to be beautiful, but was quietly impressive all the same. Edgar Ashford met her in the yard. He was not quite what she had expected. The men she knew who ran large cattle operations tended to wear their authority visibly in the width of their stance, the volume of their voice, the way they measured a person by their obvious utility. Edgar Ashford was not like that. He was lean and quiet, with dark brown hair that the sun had touched with something close to copper at the ends, and eyes of that startling pale blue that she noticed immediately and then made a conscious decision to stop noticing. He took off his hat when he greeted her. He did not look at her the way some men look at women who have come to ask for work, as though assessing what else might be on offer. He looked at her with a direct, considered attention that was respectful precisely because it was impersonal. "Miss Archer," he said, "I appreciate you making the ride out." "Thank you for seeing me," she said. "I will be direct about my terms." "I appreciate that too," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. They sat at the kitchen table in the main house, which was clean and functional and almost entirely devoid of personal expression. the way a space looks when it has been lived in primarily by necessity rather than by choice. Beatrice stated her terms clearly. She would cook 3 meals a day for the ranch crew through the spring roundup season, which ran roughly from March through June. She required a fair wage, access to the cookhouse which she would run as she saw fit, a private room in the main house if possible, and it was understood by both parties that her employment ended when roundup ended, and she would not be asked to stay longer than the agreed season. Edgar listened to all of this with his hands flat on the table and his full attention on her face. "That is reasonable," he said. "The private room is yours. The cookhouse is yours to manage. The wage I can meet." He named a number that was better than she had expected. "And the end date is understood. You are here for the season." "Only for the season," she confirmed, with a firmness that was partly for him and partly, she would later admit to herself, for her own benefit. "Only for the season," he agreed quietly. She started work the following morning. The first breakfast she produced for the Ashford Ranch crew was a declaration of capability. Scrambled eggs with dried peppers and salt pork, a pan of biscuits that emerged from the oven golden and perfectly separated, a pot of strong coffee, and a dried peach preserve she found in the pantry that she heated and thinned with a little water into something almost luxurious. The 12 men who filed into the cookhouse at 5:30 in the morning were a mixed assembly of ages and origins, and they sat down with the guarded expressions of people who had been eating burned beans for a week and were not yet willing to be hopeful. The biscuits converted them in approximately 4 bites. By the time they rose from the table to start the morning's work, there was a kind of reverent silence among them that is specific to people who have just been surprised by something unexpectedly good. Old Frank, the foreman, a man of about 50 with a gray mustache and the crow's feet of a man who had spent 30 years squinting into the Texas sun, stopped at the cookhouse door. "Miss Archer," he said, "that was one hell of a breakfast." "Language," she said, without turning from the stove. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "that was one extraordinary breakfast." Edgar Ashford came to breakfast that first morning with everyone else. He sat at the end of the long cookhouse table, apart from the crew in a way that was not unfriendly but was simply the slight separateness of a man whose role required it. He ate with the same quiet efficiency that seemed to characterize everything he did. He was one of the last to finish. When he rose to leave, he carried his plate to the washing bucket without being asked, which none of the other men had done, and he stopped at the door. "Miss Archer," he said, "that was genuinely good, thank you." "That is what you are paying me for," she said. "I know," he said. "It still deserves to be said." He left. Beatrice stood at the stove and looked at the door for a moment longer than was necessary, and then she turned back to the washing up and told herself that there was nothing remarkable about a man with good manners. The rhythm of the ranch settled around her like a familiar song in an unfamiliar key. She rose before dawn to stoke the cookhouse stove and begin the breakfast preparations. The mornings were the busiest, the most demanding, the time when she had to produce quantity and quality simultaneously for 12 hungry men preparing for a full day of hard physical labor. The midday meal was simpler, often taken in the field, where she or Pete would carry out covered pots on the back of a flatbed wagon. The evening meal was the one that had the most room, the one she allowed herself to care about most. The evenings in that cookhouse, as March gave way to April and the bluebonnets pushed up through the creek pastures in their improbable abundance, became something she had not anticipated. The men came in tired and grateful, and gradually dropped their public faces in the warmth of a good meal. She learned their stories by listening, because she was very good at listening. There was Frank, who had come up from Mexico as a young man and had earned his foreman's position by being the most trustworthy man Edgar's father had ever met. There were the Rodriguez brothers, Marco and Luis, both in their 20s, who worked cattle with a fluid, practiced ease that was something close to beautiful to watch. There was old Amos, the only black hand on the crew, A man who had been a freedman for 17 years and who still sometimes had the careful watchfulness of someone measuring the room before deciding how comfortable to be. A watchfulness that Beatrice recognized and honored without making a production of it. There were others, each with their own particular history and personality, and she cooked for all of them with the same care, which they felt and responded to. Edgar ate dinner in the cookhouse with the crew every evening. This surprised her at first. She had expected the owner of the ranch to take his meals separately, in the main house, with the slightly elevated remove that was traditional for men of his position. But Edgar Ashford sat at the end of that long table every night and ate with his men, and the dynamic it created was one of the reasons, she slowly came to understand, that his crew was so loyal and so effective. He was not talkative at dinner. He listened. He asked occasional, pointed questions about the day's work. He laughed at things that were genuinely funny and did not perform laughter at things that were not. He was, she observed over many evenings, a man of considerable internal depth who had learned to wear a surface of reserve that many people probably mistook for coldness. The thing about cooking for someone every day is that you learn them in a way that is intimate without being intentional. You learn what they eat first and what they save. You learn whether they hold their fork loosely or with a grip. You learn whether they eat with urgency or with attention. Edgar Ashford ate with attention. He was never the first to finish. He tasted things in a way that suggested he was genuinely, thoughtfully tasting them, rather than simply fueling himself. And on the first Thursday of April, he did something that stopped Beatrice's hand mid-motion at the stove. He asked for seconds. She had made a venison stew that night, with dried chilies she had found in the pantry and wild onions from the creek bank, and a generous hand with the cumin, and it was one of the best things she had made since arriving. The men had been unanimous in their appreciation, but when the others had pushed back from the table, Edgar Ashford remained sitting, and he looked down the table toward her with that direct, careful look of his. "Miss Archer," he said, "would there be more of that stew?" She looked at the pot on the stove. There was more. There was almost always more because she had learned to make generous quantities and had not yet recalibrated for how much the men actually ate. "There is," she said. "Would you mind?" he said and held out his bowl. She brought the pot to the table and ladled it out, and he said, "Thank you," with a simple sincerity that somehow struck her as more meaningful than the general acclaim of 12 men, and she did not examine why. She went back to the stove. Edgar ate his second slowly. He was the last person in the cookhouse that night, and when he finally rose and carried his bowl to the bucket, he paused. "That was something exceptional," he said. "The chili in it, the way it builds." "My mother taught me that stew," Beatrice said without quite meaning to. She was from New Mexico territory. She had a different hand with chili than most Texas cooks. "It shows," he said. "In the best possible way." He left. She stood at the stove and listened to his boots on the wooden step outside, and she told herself that a man complimenting her cooking was a professional courtesy and nothing more. April deepened. The roundup work intensified, the days growing longer and harder as the crew worked to brand and tally the new calves and push the breeding stock to the summer pastures. The men came to the cookhouse each evening with an appetite that was almost ferocious, and Beatrice fed them magnificently. She made a chicken and dumplings on the night of a cold spring rain that had old Frank saying grace over it with genuine feeling. She roasted a quarter of beef over the outdoor pit one Sunday, and served it with corn pudding and pickled cabbage, and a pan cake soaked in dried fruit syrup that had the Rodriguez brothers requesting the recipe for their mother. She baked bread 3 times a week, and the smell of it moved through the whole ranch compound in the early mornings like a benevolent spirit. And every night, Edgar Ashford asked for seconds, not always of everything, sometimes just of the bread, sometimes just a second cup of the gravy. Once, on a night she made a potato soup that she had been uncertain about, he asked for a full second bowl and ate it with a concentration that told her it was genuinely good and not just courtesy. She began, without allowing herself to acknowledge she was doing it, to cook with him in mind. To think about what would be good specifically, what would reward the kind of careful, attentive eating he brought to her table. This was dangerous. She knew it was dangerous. She had come to the Ashford ranch for the season and the season only. She had a plan. Settle the deed to her father's land, decide whether to sell it or find a tenant for it, build a small reserve of money from the cooking wages, and then make a proper independent life somewhere with enough population to sustain a boarding kitchen or a cook's position in a good hotel. She was not here to develop feelings for her employer. She was especially not here to develop feelings for a man whose life was rooted 12 miles from town in the Texas Hill Country, whose entire existence was built around land. She was trying to figure out whether to sell. She had these conversations with herself with great clarity and firmness every night in her room in the main house, lying on the good feather mattress that had been provided without her asking, and listening to the creak below the window. Then morning would come, and she would get up and make breakfast, and Edgar Ashford would come in with the rest of the crew and eat quietly and carefully at the end of the long table, and everything she had been so clear about the night before became somewhat less sharp at the edges. The conversation that changed things happened in the third week of April. Beatrice had gone to the General Mercantile in Crockett Bend that day with Pete and the wagon to bring back a week's worth of supplies. While Pete loaded the flour and salt and dried beans, Beatrice went to the county recorder's office to make progress on the matter of her father's deed. The clerk was a small, perspiring man named Haverson who shuffled through his ledgers with an air of bureaucratic importance that Beatrice found immediately irritating. "Archer," he said. "Thomas Archer, 40 acres on the South Fork of Lone Creek. Yes, I see the filing." He squinted at the ledger. "There is a notation here. The deed was transferred to a third party holding pending a debt resolution about 18 months ago, a Mr. E. Ashford of Crockett County." Beatrice felt the world go very still. "I beg your pardon," she said. "The deed is being held by Ashford," Haverson said, with the mild tone of a man delivering information he considers to be entirely routine. "There was apparently a debt between your father's estate and the Ashford operation. Common enough. I would suppose you'd want to take it up directly with Mr. Ashford." Beatrice rode back to the ranch in the wagon beside Pete and said almost nothing the entire 12 miles, which Pete, who was a perceptive young man despite his youth, recognized as a sign that he should also say nothing. She spent the rest of that day working. She made the evening meal. She served it. She watched Edgar Ashford sit at the end of the table and eat with his characteristic quiet attention, and she felt something moving in her chest that was cold and sharp and deeply confused, because it was both the first stages of real anger and also, underneath it, a fear that she had been made a fool of. But she did not confront him that night, because Beatrice Archer had not survived 4 years of managing her life alone by acting on incomplete information, and she needed to think. She thought for 3 days. During those 3 days, she cooked with the same care and competence she always brought to her work, because her professional pride did not allow her to do otherwise. She cooked, and Edgar asked for seconds as he always did, and she served them with steady hands and a face that gave nothing away. She had grown up in a world where women were expected to perform serenity regardless of inner weather, and she was very good at it. But she was also gathering information. She talked to old Frank at the end of a long evening when the others had gone. In the easy way she had learned to open conversations with him, and she learned things. She learned that Thomas Archer, her father, had borrowed money from the elder Ashford, Edgar's father, some years before Thomas's death. The loan had been secured against the land. Thomas had died before the debt was settled, and the estate had been murky enough that the resolution had dragged for years. She learned that Edgar had taken over the management of this debt, as he had taken over everything else his father left, with methodical seriousness. She learned, and this was the piece that stopped her cold, that Edgar had been the one to prevent the land from being sold outright at a sheriff's auction 18 months ago. He had stepped in and held the deed himself, which meant the debt was technically owed to him personally, and which also meant he had not yet collected on it. Why didn't he just sell it? She asked Frank, keeping her voice as neutral as she could manage. Frank was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man who is choosing his words carefully. Edgar is not a man who does things in a hurry, Frank said. He holds things until he understands what the right use of them is. Beatrice said nothing. She looked at the fire in the cookhouse stove through the gap in the iron door, and thought about a man who had held her father's land for 18 months without selling it, who had then hired her to cook knowing exactly who she was and what that land meant, and who had sat at her table every single night and asked for seconds. The question that was eating her alive was not whether he had known about the deed when he hired her. He must have. The question was why. What was his hidden motive? Was this some elaborate trap, some way of managing her presence and her potential claim while he decided what to do with the land? Was she being handled, or was there something else entirely? She confronted him on the evening of the third day. She had waited until the crew had finished and dispersed. She had set the plate down a little harder than she intended. She had said the words she had been holding. And now she stood at that table looking at the folded deed document lying between them, and Edgar Ashford was standing across from it with something in his eyes that she had not put there with her anger. "Tell me," she said. Her voice was steadier now. The initial heat of it had burned down to something more focused. "Tell me exactly why you held that deed, and tell me why you hired me." Edgar picked up the deed and held it in both hands, not opening it, just holding it. "I held the deed because I did not want to see that land sold to a speculator," he said. "The debt was legitimate. Your father borrowed from mine, that is true. But the land was his life's work, and there was no urgency on my part to collect on a dead man's estate. I held it because I was waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For whatever the right answer was," he said. "I did not know what that was yet." Beatrice studied him. "And when you hired me, you knew exactly who I was." "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Then why did you not tell me?" Here something shifted in his face. A careful thing. A thing he was deciding about. "Because I wanted to know you first," he said. "Before you knew about the deed, before it was between us." He set the document flat on the table. "I knew that once you found out about that deed, every interaction between us would be filtered through it. You would be wondering what I wanted from you, whether there were strings. I wanted to have time with you that was not about that. I wanted—" He stopped. Beatrice waited. "I wanted to sit at your table," he said quietly, and the simplicity of it landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water, sending out rings in every direction. "I wanted to eat the food you made and talk with the men, and have evenings that felt like something. I have been running this ranch alone for 6 years, Miss Archer, and this spring was the first time in 6 years that there was something at the end of the working day worth coming home to." The silence after that was of a different quality than the angry silence before. Beatrice looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the deed on the table. She looked at her own hands, which were, she noticed with a distant surprise, not quite steady. "You should have told me," she said. But it was a different statement than when she had first said it. It did not have the same blade in it. "I know," he said. "I am telling you now." She reached out and picked up the deed. She looked at it. Her father's name was on it, and the handwriting of the original filing was her father's own careful script on the copy, and looking at it felt like finding something she had not known was lost. "What do you want to do with it?" she said. "That," Edgar said, "is entirely up to you." She set the deed back down on the table between them. "I am going to think about that," she said. "And in the morning I am going to make breakfast, and we are going to talk about this properly. Not tonight." "All right," he said. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. "Edgar," she said, and the use of his given name was not accidental. She saw him register it. "Yes." "The seconds," she said, "every night." Was that she could not quite finish it. A pause. Then quietly, "Yes," he said. "It was." She walked out into the warm April night with the stars blazing above the Texas hill country and her heart doing something complex and frightening, and underneath all of it, very much alive. She did not sleep well that night. But when she rose before dawn and built the fire in the cookhouse stove and began the biscuit dough, she found herself thinking not with the brittle anger of a woman who has been deceived, but with the curious, alert attention of a woman who has discovered that a situation she thought she understood is much more interesting than she had believed. She had said she would cook for the season. She had meant it as a professional statement of terms. She had not considered the possibility that a season could change a person. Edgar Ashford appeared in the cookhouse door at 6 that morning before the rest of the crew, which was not his usual habit. "May I come in?" he said. "The cookhouse is open to anyone who is hungry," she said without turning from the stove. He sat down at the table. She heard the chair scrape and settle. She turned around and put a cup of coffee in front of him. "I would like to propose something," he said. "Go ahead." "The deed," he said. "The debt it represents was $140. Your father borrowed it for a cattle purchase that did not go as planned. I would like to forgive the debt entirely and sign the deed over to you." Beatrice's hands went still on the coffee pot. "That is 40 acres of land," she said. "That is not a small thing to just forgive." "No," he agreed, "it is not." "Then why?" He looked at her across the table, direct and unwavering as always. "Because the land is yours," he said. "Whatever the paperwork says about debts, that land was your father's life and it should be yours by right. I do not need it. My operation sits on 3,000 acres. An additional 40 on the south fork of the creek would not change my situation in any material way." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "And because I did not handle this correctly from the beginning, and I would like to correct that." She sat down across from him. This was unusual. She rarely sat during working hours. "Edgar," she said, "why did you not just send me a letter? When you heard I was coming to town, why go through all this? The job, the season, all of it." He looked at her for a long time. Outside, the creek moved over its limestone bed in the gray pre-dawn light, and somewhere in the mesquite trees a mockingbird started up its extravagant recital. "Because I wanted you to stay," he said. "Not at my expense, not out of obligation. I wanted you to have a reason to stay that was yours, not mine." Beatrice sat with that. She turned it over and looked at the underside of it. "The land," she said slowly. "You thought if I had the land I might have reason to stay in the county." "Yes," he said, "partly. And partly," his pale eyes held hers. "Partly I wanted to know if you wanted to, and the only way to know that was to spend time with you. By feeding you," she said, with something that was almost a smile. "By being fed by you," he corrected gently. "There is a difference." They looked at each other across the table in the early morning light, with the fire in the stove casting a warm glow across the kitchen, and the coffee between them and the whole complicated, carefully constructed situation they had arrived at lying open between them without pretense. "I am going to need time to think about all of this," Beatrice said. "I know," he said. "I am also going to need you to understand that I have been managing my own life alone for 4 years, and I am not a woman who makes decisions based on feeling before she has thought them through properly." "I would not expect otherwise," he said. "Good," she said, and stood up, because the biscuits were ready to come out of the oven and the crew would be arriving in 20 minutes, and she was not going to let any personal emotional upheaval interfere with a properly made breakfast. She did not forgive him all at once. That was not how Beatrice Archer worked. She was a woman who had learned the hard way that trust was not restored by declarations, but by behavior, by consistency, by the accumulation of small, accurate acts over time. She watched Edgar Ashford in the days after their conversation with the same careful, observant attention she had always brought to understanding the people around her. What she found was this: Edgar was exactly who he appeared to be. He was a man of unusual patience, of genuine principle, of a reserve that was not coldness but a kind of self-protective silence that he had built in the years of running the ranch alone, years during which there had been no one around him who expected him to be more than competent and decisive. He did not talk about himself easily, but he did talk when she created the conditions for it, and what he said was consistently honest and consistently interesting. He knew this land with an intimacy that was almost geological. He could describe the way the creek changed in different seasons, the behavior of the mesquite roots, the migration patterns of the deer through the cedar breaks, the small particular character of each pasture. He talked about his father with a complicated respect, the kind given to a man you admired enormously, who also never quite knew how to say the things that mattered. He talked about his mother, who had died when he was 16, with a quiet grief that had been carried so long it had become part of his resting expression. He had one brother, James, who had gone east to study law in Austin and who wrote dutiful, infrequent letters. He began helping her with small things in the cookhouse in the evenings, after the crew had gone. Not intruding, not offering to do things she could manage, but being present. Filling the water barrel when it ran low. Carrying heavy bags from the storeroom. Once, on a night when she had burned her hand slightly on the oven rack, appearing silently with a piece of clean linen and the cool compress of a wet cloth before she had thought to look for either. "You do not have to hover," she told him, on a Wednesday evening in early May when he had stayed particularly late. "I am not hovering," he said. "I am sitting. You are sitting and watching." "I am sitting and being in the same room," he said. "I enjoy being in this room." She looked at him. He was leaning back in the chair at the end of the table with his long legs stretched out and his arms crossed over his chest, utterly comfortable, utterly at ease in a way she had not seen him be in any other setting. "You are different in here than you are anywhere else," she said before she could decide not to. He considered this. "Yes," he said. "Why?" "Because this room is warm," he said simply. "And it smells like food someone made with care, and you are in it." He said the last part without any particular emphasis, as though it was simply the completing element of the list, which somehow made it more devastating than if he had made a performance of it. Beatrice turned back to the stove and told her heart, very firmly, to behave. She accepted the deed at the end of the first week of May. Edgar had a lawyer from town ride out. A decent man named Caldwell who clearly thought the whole arrangement was somewhat unusual, but who was professional enough not to editorialize. The debt was formally forgiven, the deed transferred into Beatrice's name, and she stood in the main house with a piece of paper in her hands that said 40 acres on the South Fork of Lone Creek belonged to her, and she felt something so large and complicated move through her that she had to stand very still for a moment and simply let it. It was the first thing that had ever truly been hers. Not borrowed, not charitable, not temporary. Hers. Edgar stood across the room while she held the document. He said nothing. He did not watch her with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who had done a good deed and expected recognition for it. He was simply present the way he had learned to be present, and the restraint of it was its own particular eloquence. "Thank you," she said when she could say it. "It was yours," he said. "I was just returning it." She looked at the deed in her hands, then she looked at him. "I want to see it," she said. "The land, I have never actually seen it." "I will take you tomorrow," he said. He did. They rode out the next morning on 2 horses, with the spring light on the creek and the air still cool from the night before, and the whole world green with May in the way that the hill country manages for about 3 weeks a year before the summer heat takes over and turns everything to gold and dust. The South Fork of Lone Creek wound through her father's 40 acres in a wide, lazy bend, creating a natural basin of bottomland that was rich with soil and volunteer pecans, and the kind of grass that made a cattleman's eyes go calm and satisfied. She did not say much. She rode through the property on the borrowed mare and felt the ground with her eyes, her father's particular, careful way of looking at land that she had learned as a girl, and by the time she came back around to where Edgar was waiting near the creek, she knew what she wanted to do with it. "I am going to keep it," she said. "I thought you might," he said. "I would need to rent it eventually. Or figure out how to make it produce something." "Cattle grazing," Edgar said immediately. "This bottomland could carry 50 head easily in a good year, more in a wet one." "I do not have cattle," she said. "I do," he said. She looked at him. He met her eyes. The creek moved between the pecan trees and a kingfisher shot past like a blue-green arrow. "That would be a business arrangement," she said carefully. "Yes," he said, "it would." And then, with the directness that was his defining characteristic, and with something in his voice that was new and slightly careful, like a man placing his foot on uncertain ground. Or it could be more than that. The spring air was very still around them. A bee moved through the clover at the creek bank. "Edgar," she said, and stopped. "I know," he said quietly. "I am not asking for a decision. I am stating a possibility. I think you already know what I feel, and I believe you are smart enough to know that I know you are not indifferent, and pretending otherwise seems like a waste of both our times." He paused. "But I also know you came here on your own terms, and you are not going to do anything that is not fully, freely your own choice. So I am stating the possibility. The rest is yours." Beatrice Archer sat on her horse on her own land in the May sunshine, and looked at a man who had held her father's land for 18 months without exploiting it, who had created a season of honest work for her rather than approaching her with an agenda she would have been right to distrust, who ate her cooking with genuine care and asked for seconds not as flattery but as truth. She was honest enough to admit, looking at a man she found genuinely compelling. His quietness, his depth. The way he knew this land and treated it, and the people on it with the same patient, attentive respect. The way he had waited, night after night, at the end of her table, being exactly who he was and nothing more, which was its own kind of courting, whether or not he had planned it as such. "I am going to need the rest of the season to decide," she said. Something moved in his face that she could only describe as relief, which told her that the possibility he had stated had cost him something to say. "The rest of the season," he said. "All right." They rode back to the ranch in the morning light, not quite side by side, not quite separate, in that particular proximity that sits on the threshold of something and has not yet crossed it. May was the month of transformation. It was not dramatic. Nothing announced itself. But the quality of the evenings in the cookhouse shifted in some way that everyone on the crew seemed to feel without commenting on directly, in the way that ranch hands are often remarkably perceptive about their employer's private life, and equally remarkable in their collective decision to say absolutely nothing about it unless forced. Old Frank sometimes caught Beatrice's eye with a look of quiet approval that he would deny to his dying day if asked about it. Marco Rodriguez once said in Spanish to his brother Louis that the ranch had never in his experience been a place where a man felt glad to come to dinner, and Louis had agreed with equal quiet certainty. Pete, the youngest hand, had developed an admirable habit of suddenly finding tasks on the far side of the bunkhouse whenever Edgar lingered in the cookhouse past the other's departure, which Beatrice appreciated without commenting on. The evenings that Edgar stayed late were the ones she found herself thinking about during the days. They talked about everything. About the cattle market and the railroad that was being extended and what it would mean for the drive routes. About the coming changes in land law and what the wire fencing of the open range would do to small operations. About books, which they had both read more of than their circumstances might suggest, Edgar having his father's small library and Beatrice having carried 3 volumes in her trunk from San Antonio. About her mother's New Mexico Territory childhood and the cooking it had produced, the chili and the blue corn, and the lamb that appeared in Beatrice's kitchen in translated form. About Edgar's memories of his father riding out before dawn, and the way a boy understands authority when it is associated with someone he loves. About small things, too. The best way to treat a horse with a stone bruise. Whether the mockingbird that sang from the old oak by the cookhouse was the same one as last year, and whether birds were capable of the kind of fidelity that would make that possible. Whether the pecan on her South Fork property would fruit in this year or needed another season. One evening in the last week of May, a thunderstorm came up fast from the southwest and hit the ranch with the violent enthusiasm of a Texas hill country front, all lightning and sheeting rain and wind that made the cookhouse shake. Most of the crew had already gone to the bunkhouse. Edgar had stayed. He sat at the table with the lantern between them while the rain hammered the roof and the lightning turned the windows white, and they talked through the full violence of the storm, and when it passed and the air came through the window clean and green and impossibly fresh, they sat in the aftermath of it and looked at each other. "I do not want you to leave at the end of the season," Edgar said. He said it simply. No preamble, no qualification, just the truth of it in the quiet after the storm. Beatrice looked at him across the lantern. The light was warm between them, and the smell of rain and cedar and the lingering wood smoke of the stove were all around them, and she felt, in that moment, with that terrible clarity that occasionally ambushes a person, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "I know," she said. A pause. "I am not going to leave," she said. Edgar was very still for a moment. Then something happened in his face that she had not seen before, a releasing of something that had been held tense for a long time, and it made him look both younger and more open than she had ever seen him. "Beatrice," he said, and the way he said it was different from every other time. "Do not make a large occasion of it," she said, though not unkindly. "I am still the same person with the same opinions and the same professional standards, and I am still going to need you to be honest with me about everything from here on, because I will not tolerate secrets a second time." "Understood," he said. "And I want a proper proposal," she said. "When you are ready to make one. Not tonight, because I have been on my feet since before dawn and I am tired. But at a time of your choosing properly, and I will give you a proper answer." He looked at her with his pale, direct eyes. "I have been ready," he said. "I have been waiting for you to be." "Then do not wait much longer," she said. He did not. On the 1st of June, which was a Sunday, Edgar Ashford rode to the South Fork of Lone Creek alone at noon and was gone for about an hour. Beatrice, who did not know he had gone there, only learned about it later. What he had done, alone on her land in the noon heat of early summer, she did not know precisely, but when he came back he had a sprig of pecan leaf in his buttonhole and a settled look about him, the look of a man who has had a conversation with something larger than himself and reached an understanding. He found her in the cookhouse garden that afternoon, where she was staking the tomato plants she had started from seed in April, and he stood on the other side of the low fence with his hat in his hands. "Beatrice," he said, "I would like to ask you to marry me." She looked up from the tomato stakes. He was not making a theatrical moment of it. He was not down on one knee, which in any case would have been logistically difficult on a rocky Texas ranch path. He was standing there, quiet and direct and fully himself, with the afternoon light on him and his hat in his hands, and in his pale eyes was everything he was and everything he was offering, which was not small. "You have to know," she said, "that I am a woman with my own land and my own opinions, and I will cook for a household because I love it and not because it is an obligation." "I know that," he said, "and I will make decisions about my property and my life in partnership with you, not in subordination to you." "I would not want it any other way," he said, and meant it. "Then yes," she said, "I will marry you." He exhaled. She realized he had been holding his breath. She walked to the fence and stood on her side of it, and he stood on his, and he reached out and took her hand carefully, as though it was something precious, and she held his hand and looked at him. "You could have told me about the deed the first day," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "And then none of this would have been what it was." She considered this. "I am not sure whether to be grateful or exasperated." "You could be both," he said. "I would understand." She was both. She let him hold her hand over the garden fence in the June afternoon, with the tomatoes staked behind her and the creek below and the pecan shade, and the whole wide Texas sky pressing down on everything with its summer weight. And she felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the future was not something to be managed or endured, but something to move toward with genuine interest. They were married in the Crockett Bend Church on the 15th of July, 1882, which was a Saturday, and which was described by every person in attendance as the hottest day of the year, a distinction that anyone who knows a July in the Texas Hill Country will understand was not bestowed lightly. Beatrice wore her good blue dress, which was not a traditional wedding color, but was the only dress she owned that was fine enough for the occasion, and which, Edgar later told her, was exactly the right color for her, which she accepted as a genuine compliment rather than courtesy because Edgar Ashford did not say things he did not mean. Old Frank stood as witness. The Rodriguez brothers sat in the front pew and Marco cried openly, which Louis pretended not to notice. Old Amos wore his best hat and sat with his back straight and his eyes bright. Even Pete managed to get his good shirt buttoned correctly, which was an achievement. The minister, a practical man named Brother Hutchins, performed the ceremony with appropriate gravity and a brevity that everyone appreciated given the temperature. After the wedding, Beatrice cooked the wedding supper herself, because it was her wedding and she was going to eat what she wanted on it. And what she wanted was the venison stew with dried chilies and wild onions, the same stew that had started this whole business of seconds. She made it in the large pot and served it to the whole crew and several families from town who had made the ride out, and it was consumed with the kind of appreciation that good food cooked with love produces in the people lucky enough to eat it. Edgar sat at the head of the table with his new wife beside him, which was a first, and he ate his stew with the same careful, grateful attention he always brought to her cooking. When the stew was nearly gone and the table was loud with conversation, he turned to her. "Miss Archer," he said, and then corrected himself immediately. "Mrs. Ashford, would there be more of this stew?" She looked at him. There was something so specifically Edgar about that moment, the deliberate quietness of it, the gentle humor, the full understanding they shared of what it meant, the private echo of all those evenings that had brought them here, that she felt an affection for him so particular and so rooted that it was nearly dizzying. "There is always more," she said. "There will always be more." She served him seconds on their wedding night, and he ate them slowly, and the table around them was full of voices and warmth and the particular gold of summer lamplight, and the Texas dark pressed friendly against the windows. The life they made was not easy, because life in the hill country of Texas in 1882 was not built for ease. The summers were brutal. The winter of 1882 to 1883 brought an ice storm that killed 30 head and split 3 fence lines, and kept everyone indoors for 2 weeks eating from the stores Beatrice had put up in the fall. There were years when the rain did not come as needed and the grass was thin, and the decisions were hard. There were market fluctuations and equipment failures, and the slow, grinding difficulty of maintaining a large cattle operation with a crew of 12 through the full cycle of seasons year after year. But the cookhouse was always warm. Beatrice ran her kitchen with the same confident authority she had always brought to it, and she expanded it in ways that made the whole ranch operation more productive. She kept a kitchen garden that grew to half an acre by their second year of marriage, producing vegetables through 3 seasons that supplemented the food stores and cut the household costs considerably. She put up preserves and pickled vegetables and dried meat with a systematic thoroughness that meant the ranch ate well even through hard stretches. She began, in the second year, to sell baked goods into Crockett Bend twice a week on the wagon, her bread and her pies and her biscuits, and the income from it was small but real and was entirely hers to manage as she chose. Edgar watched all of this with the same quiet, attentive regard he had always given her, and he did not interfere, and he did not offer unsolicited opinions, and he did not treat her commercial instincts as a hobby, because he was a man who recognized capability and respected it regardless of the gender it arrived in. He did, occasionally, have opinions about how she proposed to spend her earnings, but he expressed them as suggestions rather than directives, and she heard them as the input of a partner rather than the commands of an authority, which was the negotiation they had established between them from the beginning, and which worked extremely well. Her land on the South Fork of Lone Creek was incorporated into the ranch's grazing rotation, as Edgar had suggested the day they had ridden there together. It fed 50 head of the ranch's cattle through the green months and rested in winter, and Beatrice received a portion of the proceeds from those cattle each year, which she put toward the ranch's shared expenses and toward a reserve account she maintained at the bank in Crockett Bend that was registered in her name alone, not because she did not trust Edgar, but because she was Beatrice Archer Ashford, and having something of her own was not negotiable. Edgar understood this completely. In November of 1883, their first child was born, a boy, which surprised everyone who had made predictions, because the women of the town had unanimously predicted a girl. They named him Thomas, for Beatrice's father, and Edgar carried him around the ranch on the first day home with the slightly stunned expression of a man for whom the reality of a specific joy has exceeded the concept of it, which Beatrice found so endearing she had to look away to compose herself. Thomas was a sturdy, cheerful child who appeared to have inherited Edgar's quietness and Beatrice's observations, which was, according to old Frank, going to make him either a remarkable person or a very difficult one. He sat in a basket near the stove in his early months while his mother cooked, and the kitchen sounds and smells were his first world, and he would always be, for the rest of his life, a man who associated warmth and the smell of good food with complete safety. There were, inevitably, difficult passages. In the spring of 1884, a man named Cutter arrived in Crockett Bend. He was a land speculator from San Antonio, one of the wave of them that moved through the hill country in the 1880s like a slow, expensive weather system, and he had his eye on several properties in the area that he believed could be consolidated into a larger holding. He had, through some research Beatrice could never quite determine the source of, identified her 40 acres on the South Fork as an orphan parcel that might be available. He came to the ranch on a Thursday and asked to see the owner. Beatrice opened the door of the main house. "I am the owner," she said. "Of which portion?" Cutter was a florid man of about 40 in a good suit that was slightly too heavy for Texas spring. He blinked at her. "The South Fork property," he said. "The Archer parcel." "The Ashford property," she corrected. "It is in my name and the name is now Ashford, and it is not for sale." Cutter recovered his professional manner and explained his offer, which was in dollars and which was objectively a fair dollar amount. He explained the benefits of consolidation. He explained the future of land values in the region. He explained several things that were probably quite persuasive to other people. Beatrice listened politely until he was done. "That land was my father's," she said. "My father spent the better part of his life getting it. It is the first thing I have ever owned outright in my life. It is not for sale at any price." Cutter tried twice more with different framings, each of which Beatrice met with the same calm, immovable certainty. Edgar appeared at her shoulder at some point during the third attempt, having heard voices from the barn. He said nothing. He simply stood there. Cutter looked at him, looked at Beatrice, and apparently decided that the combination of the two of them was not a negotiation he was likely to win. He left. Edgar watched him go. "Were you planning to chase him off yourself?" Edgar said. "I was managing perfectly well," Beatrice said. "I know," he said. "I came to watch." She looked at him. He was almost smiling. "You are occasionally intolerable," she said. "You are always magnificent," he said. She went back into the house and her husband's almost smile followed her in like warmth. The seasons turned. 1884 moved into 1885, the summer long and fierce and productive, with good rains in August that brought the creek up and turned the pastures green again after the July burn. Beatrice found herself pregnant again in the fall of 1885, which they both greeted with the particular mixture of joy and practical calculation that characterizes a second pregnancy, the joy being real and immediate, and the calculation being about sleeping arrangements and how long into the season she could comfortably manage the full kitchen operations. The answer, it turned out, was right up until the day before, because Beatrice was constitutionally incapable of leaving a kitchen half-managed. Edgar had hired a young woman from town named Clara to help in the kitchen through the later months, a smart, eager girl of 19 who learned quickly, and who was smart enough to recognize that her job was to support Beatrice's vision rather than substitute her own, and who did so with good cheer. Their second child, a girl, arrived in January of 1886. They named her Eleanor, for no particular ancestor, but because it was a name that sounded like someone who would eventually have opinions, which seemed appropriate for a daughter of Beatrice Archer Ashford. Eleanor was, from approximately her third week of life, the most emphatic person on the property, which was saying something. Old Frank held her at the Christmas before her first birthday and declared that she would run something significant one day. He was not wrong, but that is a story for another time. The Ashford ranch grew, not recklessly, not with the breathless ambition of the land rush that was consuming other parts of Texas, but with the measured, thoughtful expansion of a man who understood his land and what it could sustain. Edgar bought an adjacent 230 acres in 1886 when the neighboring Prute family sold out and moved to San Antonio. He improved the breeding stock. He built a new barn and renovated the bunkhouse and put a proper wood floor in the cookhouse, which Beatrice had mentioned wanting exactly once and which appeared under her feet one morning in April as though it had always been there. She stood in the cookhouse on the new floor and turned to look at Edgar, who was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed. "You installed a floor," she said. "I did," he said, "without telling me." "It was a floor," he said. "It did not require a discussion." She looked at the floor. It was clean, tight-fitted pine boards, well sanded, and it was going to be so much better on her feet during the long cooking days than the packed earth that had been there before. "Thank you," she said. "You mentioned it in October," he said, "and again in February in passing. I heard you." She looked at him. He heard everything. He always had. It was one of the defining qualities of a man who had chosen to love someone by paying attention, which is the most sustainable kind of love there is. "Come to breakfast," she said. "In a minute," he said. "Will there be biscuits?" "Edgar Ashford," she said, "there are always biscuits." In 1887, a drought came to the hill country that was the worst in 20 years. It came slowly, the way droughts do, beginning with a dry spring that everyone told themselves would break, and then a summer with no relief, and then a fall that should have been wet and was not. The creek on the South Fork dropped to a series of disconnected pools by October. The pastures went brown and stayed brown. The cattle had to be moved and consolidated, and some sold early to prevent loss. And the calculations Edgar made at the kitchen table in the evenings were hard numbers. Beatrice sat across from him one night in late October with the account books between them, Thomas asleep in his room and Eleanor in hers, and she looked at the numbers, and the numbers were tight but not impossible. "My reserve account," she said. "We can draw from it to carry the operation through the winter if the drought holds." Edgar looked up. "That is your money," he said. "We are the same person," she said. "It is our money." "Beatrice, Edgar," she said firmly but not harshly. "I am not diminished by contributing to this ranch. I am invested in it. Everything here is ours together." She paused. "We can rebuild the reserve when the rain comes back, and the rain will come back." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are certain," he said. "About the rain coming back or about the money?" "Both, I suppose." "Yes to both," she said. "Have some faith." The rain came back in March of 1888. Not all at once, but steadily, the cloud systems pushing up from the Gulf in a pattern that broke the drought with a thoroughness that had the whole hill country exhaling in unison. By April the creek was running again, and the grass was green, and the cattle Edgar had managed through the hard winter were in decent condition, and the calving season was better than expected. On the evening of the day the South Fork Creek ran full again for the first time since the previous summer, Edgar came in from a ride and found Beatrice at the stove with the best venison stew she had made in years, because one of the hands had brought down a good buck that morning, and she had been saving the dried chilies from the fall store for something worth cooking. He sat down at the table. The children were in bed. It was just the two of them. She served the stew and sat down across from him, which she did sometimes in the evenings now. The cook and the rancher and the husband and wife together at the table in the warm kitchen. And they ate and talked about the creek and the calves and what the spring roundup numbers were likely to look like. And whether Thomas, who was 4 years old and already insisted on following his father to the barn every morning, was too young for his own pony yet, which was a debate that had been running for several weeks. Edgar ate his stew with the same focused attention he had always brought to her cooking. When his bowl was empty, he did not rush. He was never the man who rushed. He sat back and looked at her across the table in the lamplight, with the sound of the creek outside the window and the whole replenished world wet and green and alive around them. "Beatrice," he said. She said, watching him. "Would there be more?" he said. She looked at him. She looked at the man she had married, the man she had cooked for 100 and 100 and 100 more evenings, the man who had held her father's land with more care than he had ever asked credit for, who had built her a floor without announcing it, who had heard every offhand thing she said and stored it and acted on it, who had eaten her cooking with the full, grateful attention of a person who understood what it meant when someone fed you well, who had asked for seconds on the first night and every night since. She felt something so large and warm in her chest that for a moment she could not speak. "There is always more," she said. "There will always be more." She brought the pot to the table and filled his bowl, and he ate his second slowly, the way he always did, and they sat together in their kitchen in the Texas Hill Country in the early spring of 1888 with the drought broken, and the land recovered, and 2 small children sleeping in the next rooms, and the future stretched ahead of them wide and green and watered and entirely, gloriously open. Their life continued to deepen in all the ways that lives do when they are built on genuine foundations. Thomas grew into a boy of remarkable steadiness, and then a young man who combined his father's patience with his mother's precision. And at the age of 12, he was already the most reliable person on the property for the small, specific tasks that required both. Alina, who had never met a convention she did not immediately interrogate, became at 7 a person of such forceful opinion that Frank told Edgar privately that the girl was going to need either a very large range or a very patient partner when she grew up. And Edgar had agreed with a combination of pride and mild concern that was entirely appropriate. In the summer of 1888, Beatrice hired Clara back as a permanent kitchen assistant because the operation had grown enough that one person, even a very capable one, could not manage it alone. Clara was 22 by then and had developed her own considerable skill, and the 2 women ran the kitchen with a professional ease and mutual respect that made the whole household function with an efficiency that outside observers found slightly astonishing. The baked goods business into Crockett Bend had expanded into a twice-weekly regular delivery, and there had been serious conversation about whether Beatrice wanted to formalize it as a commercial arrangement with the mercantile, which she was still considering. She was not a woman who moved without full consideration, and the consideration was ongoing. On a September evening of that year, with the summer heat finally beginning to release and the first cool fronts pushing down from the north, and turning the air at night to something almost gentle, Beatrice stood at the cookhouse stove and made a pecan pie from the pecans she had collected herself from the trees on her South Fork land. The pecans were particularly good that year, the drought having given way to such an excellent wet spring and summer that the trees had produced abundantly. The pie came out of the oven amber and fragrant and exactly right, and she let it cool on the windowsill where the evening breeze would work through it. And when Edgar came in from the last walkthrough of the day, she had a slice ready for him. He sat down and ate it with the full ceremony of his attention which a pecan pie made from her own land's pecans deserved. He was quiet for a long moment after. "That," he said, "might be the best thing you have ever made." "The pecans are from the South Fork," she said. He looked up. "The big tree at the bend." "Yes." He was quiet again, She knew he was thinking about the land, about the fact of it, about the particular and private meaning of those specific pecans having traveled from that specific ground to this specific kitchen. "Beatrice," he said. "Yes," she said. "Thank you," he said, "for staying." She sat down across from him. The lantern was between them, and the Texas night was settling in around the cookhouse, and the children were somewhere outside with Frank, having been given 15 more minutes before bed, and everything was as it should be. "Thank you for eating slowly," she said. He looked at her. "If you had rushed," she said, "if you had been like every other man who shovels his food and pushes back from the table and is gone before the evening has a chance to be anything, I might never have paid attention. I might have stayed through roundup and left in June, and that would have been the whole of it." She looked at her hands. "But you ate slowly, and you asked for seconds, and you were always the last one there." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "I did not know how else to stay close to you," he said. "It was the only place you were every night." "The cookhouse," she said. "Yes," he said, "the cookhouse." She turned her hand over and held his. The pecan pie was finished between them. The children came in, dusty and protesting bedtime with vigor. Eleanor had apparently made Frank carry her on his back the last quarter mile, which Frank denied with the dignity of a man who absolutely had. Thomas had a grasshopper in his pocket that he intended to study in the morning. Edgar lifted Eleanor onto his hip, and Beatrice walked Thomas down the hall to his room, and the grasshopper was negotiated into a jar with holes poked in the lid, and 2 small people were settled into beds, and 2 adults walked back through the quiet house and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the stars over the Texas plateau. It was an ordinary evening. It was the best kind of ordinary, the kind built out of years of small, careful, intentional things. The kind that holds. By the spring of 1889, Beatrice had formalized the baked goods arrangement with the Crockett Bend Mercantile, and her name was on a contract as a commercial supplier, which made her feel a satisfaction she did not try to minimize. Edgar had expanded the ranch's water infrastructure, digging 2 additional stock tanks that would make the next drought, whenever it came, less of a crisis. Thomas was 5 and had been given a small pony named General, which turned out to be the correct decision, as the boy's face on the morning of the gift was something Edgar and Beatrice both carried for the rest of their lives. Eleanor was 3 and had opinions about the pony that she communicated at significant volume. Old Frank celebrated his 60th birthday that April, and Beatrice made him a cake of such magnitude and quality that he was unable to maintain his usual dignified reserve about it, and admitted openly to being moved, which the whole crew pretended not to notice in deference to his feelings. Amos, who had been with the ranch since Edgar's father's time, came to Beatrice one morning that spring with a question he had clearly been considering for a long time. He was thinking, he said carefully, of trying to acquire a small piece of land of his own. He had been saving for years. He knew of a parcel in the next county. He was asking her, he said, because she had done it, and he wanted to know what she thought the important things were to know before a person tried. Beatrice sat him down at the kitchen table and gave him a cup of coffee and talked with him for the better part of an hour. She told him about deed recordings and debt resolution, and the importance of having a lawyer look at anything before he signed. She told him about the county recorder's process. She told him to ask for everything in writing and to trust the writing more than the handshake. She told him that owning something outright was worth whatever difficulty it took to get there. Amos listened to all of it with the serious attention of a man who is planning carefully, and at the end he thanked her with a formality that told her he understood what it had cost her to share the specific knowledge of her own experience. "You think I can do it?" he said. "I think," she said, "that you are one of the most capable people I know, and the only question has ever been whether the world will be decent enough to let you." She paused. "But you already know that, and you have been doing it anyway." He looked at her for a moment with something very quiet and very solid in his eyes. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I have." He bought the land the following autumn. Edgar Ashford co-signed nothing and offered no financial assistance, because Amos had not asked for it. But he did write a letter of character to the seller's lawyer that was, by all accounts, straightforward and unambiguous and entirely useful. The years gathered themselves into something larger than the sum of their days. In the spring of 1891, Beatrice discovered she was expecting again, which arrived as a surprise given that Alina was 5, and they had privately thought the matter of children was perhaps complete. It was not, it turned out complete. In November, a second boy arrived, and they named him Henry, and he was from his earliest days the most purely cheerful person any of them had ever encountered, a quality that was delightful in a baby, and suggested a character that would stand him in excellent stead through a life that, like all lives, would bring its share of difficulty. Thomas, who was 7 by then, received his brother with the solemn, responsible dignity of an older child who takes the role seriously. Alina received her second brother with the slightly proprietorial benevolence of a person who has assigned herself to be in charge of him, which Henry appeared to accept as entirely appropriate. Edgar sat with his wife on the evening after Henry came home, with the older children asleep and the baby in his cradle, and the house quiet around them. He was 41 years old and she was 35, and they had been married 9 years, and the life between them was something so layered and specific and real that it would have been impossible to describe to someone who had not lived a version of it. He said after a long, comfortable silence, "I still ask for seconds." "I know," she said, smiling. "I will ask for seconds when I am 80, he said. "Good," she said. "There will always be more." He took her hand. Outside, a mockingbird, possibly the same one, possibly one of its descendants, sang from the oak by the cookhouse in the mild November dark. Its song, a long improvisational chain of borrowed music, offered for no particular reason into the listening night. By 1894, the Ashford operation had grown into the most respected cattle ranch in Crockett County, known not only for the quality of its stock, but for the unusual loyalty of its crew, several of whom had been with Edgar for more than a decade, which was remarkable in an industry where hands moved frequently. The reason for the loyalty was not complicated. The ranch paid fairly, treated its people with consistent respect, and fed them extraordinarily well. The cookhouse was still Beatrice's domain. She had, over the years, made certain structural improvements that Edgar had arranged without being asked twice about any of them, because he was a man who paid attention. The stove was upgraded in 1890 to a larger model that handled the ranch's expanding kitchen needs. A proper root cellar was dug adjacent to the cookhouse in 1892. A second kitchen garden plot was opened in 1893, managed partly by Clara and partly by whatever child was old enough to be given the responsibility of a specific row, which turned out to be an excellent system for teaching children that food comes from effort and care. Beatrice's commercial baking arrangement with the Crockett Bend Mercantile had expanded over the years into something that now produced a real and significant income, and she had begun, quietly, to think about what that accumulation of income might eventually become. She did not share this thinking with anyone except Edgar, and Edgar, who had married a woman of considerable practical intelligence and was deeply grateful for it, listened and offered his thoughts when asked and otherwise stayed out of it, which was the right move. One morning in the fall of 1895, she told him what she had decided. She was going to fund a community kitchen in Crockett Bend. Not a restaurant exactly. A place where families who needed meals could come, and where women who needed income could cook, and where the two things could meet in a practical and dignified way. She had the reserve for it. She had spent 3 years quietly thinking about it. She had talked to the minister, who was on board, and to 2 women in town who she thought could run the day-to-day operations. She needed a building, which was the remaining piece. Edgar listened to all of this across the kitchen table with his coffee going cold and his whole attention on her face, When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from me?" he said. "The building on the corner of Church and Main," she said. "The one your father bought in 1875. It has been empty for 3 years." He looked at her. "I would like to lease it at a nominal rate," she said. "I am not asking for it as a gift. This is a business transaction." "Beatrice," he said, "you can have the building, not as a lease, as yours." "It is a valuable property," she said. "Yes," he said, "so is everything you have built here, so are you." She looked at him steadily. He met her eyes. "As mine," she said finally. "As yours," he said. The Crockett Bend Community Kitchen opened in March of 1896. Beatrice stood at the door on the opening day and watched the first families come in, and she felt something she recognized from the day the deed had been transferred into her name, a kind of rightness that is specific to things that are both practical and good. She did not make a speech. She was not a woman for speeches. She went to the kitchen and made sure the stove was right and the biscuits were on time. Thomas was 12 by then, old enough to help carry supplies. Eleanor was 10 and had offered a comprehensive set of suggestions for how the kitchen should be organized, some of which were actually excellent and were implemented. Henry was 4 and was mostly interested in whether there would be pie. There was pie. There was always pie. On a June evening of 1896, with the hill country summer fully arrived, and the ranch in its rhythm and the children ranging variously through the stages of childhood and the community kitchen in town operating with a satisfying efficiency, Edgar came in late from the pastures, later than usual, having been out to check on a fence line in the back section that had been reported weak. He was tired. He sat down at the table and Beatrice put food in front of him without asking what he wanted, because after 14 years she knew, and what she knew was that on a hot, tired evening, he wanted the cold leftover roasted chicken and the cucumber vinegar salad and the cornbread that she kept specifically for days like this. And she set all of it in front of him and sat down across the table with her own cup of water. He ate. She watched him, not intrusively, just in the companionable way of long familiarity, the easy attention of two people who have shared a table for so many years that silence between them is as comfortable as conversation. He finished and sat back. He looked at her. "Beatrice," he said. "Yes," she said. "Is there more cornbread?" he said. She looked at him. In the lamplight he was 46 years old and the years were on him, and also the years were good on him, the way they are on people who have lived in honest engagement with their lives. His pale eyes were the same as they had always been, direct and clear and full of something that was specifically for her. She got up and brought him the rest of the cornbread, and she stood beside him for a moment rather than sitting back down, and he looked up at her and she put her hand on his shoulder briefly, the lightest acknowledgement of everything they were to each other. "There is always more," she said. He put his hand over hers. "I know," he said. "That is why I keep asking." Outside the cookhouse the Texas night settled warm and full of stars over the limestone hills and the pecan trees on the South Fork Creek and the cattle in the pastures and the sleeping children and the whole broad, earned, particular life they had made. The mockingbird sang. The creek moved over its rocks. The fire in the stove burned down to coals. Beatrice Archer Ashford, who had said she would only cook for the season, who had planned a careful, solitary, independent future, and arrived with her cast iron skillet and her mother's brooch, and no intention of staying beyond June, sat at her kitchen table in the house that had been hers for 14 years, on land that was hers by right, beside a man who had loved her with patience and attention and the daily honest act of asking for more. She had cooked every evening of those years with the full gift of her skill and her care. And he had eaten slowly and savored it and asked for seconds every night, and she had understood finally and completely that this was not a man who was simply hungry for food. He was hungry for her, for this kitchen, for this life, for the particular warmth of a place where someone who loved you had put care into every element of what they offered you, and she had given it to him freely, of her own full choice. The children grew. The ranch thrived. The community kitchen in town fed families through lean years and celebrations both, and became the kind of institution that a small community eventually stops imagining it existed without, the way useful things become invisible with time. Old Frank retired in 1898 with a ceremony that was dignified and a supper that was historic, and Marco Rodriguez became the new foreman, a position he filled with exactly the competence that the years of watching Frank had prepared him for. Amos wrote from his land in the next county with news of a good cattle season, and a letter of pride in the careful, complete words of a man who had learned to read as an adult and still treated written language with a particular deliberateness and respect. Clara married a decent farmer from the north of the county in 1897 and came back to help in the kitchen 3 mornings a week, because the community kitchen had been her second home for years, and she was not ready to leave it entirely, and because Beatrice was glad to have her. Thomas, at 18, had become a young man of such obvious capability that several ranchers in the county had quietly inquired whether he might be available to manage their operations, which he was not, because the Ashford Ranch was where he was going to spend his life, and everyone including Thomas understood this clearly. Eleanor, at 16, had decided she wanted to study, which required going to school in San Antonio, which was the source of the longest and most detailed conversation Edgar and Beatrice had in the whole of their married life, held across the kitchen table over 3 evenings, at the end of which Edgar said that his daughter was going to school in San Antonio, and they were going to figure out the rest. And Beatrice had looked at him and thought that this was precisely why she had said yes on that day at the garden fence. Henry, at 8, was the happiest child anyone had ever seen, and had recently been assigned his own row in the kitchen garden, which he tended with a joyful imprecision that produced surprisingly good results. On the last evening of the 19th century, the 31st of December in the year 1899, the Ashford Ranch held a supper that brought together every person who had been part of that life over the years. Old Frank came from town, where he kept a small house now. Marco and Louis both came with their families, the Rodriguez children running through the yard in the mild winter evening. Clara and her husband came. The minister came. Several neighboring families came. Amos came, having made the 2-day ride from his county, and stood at Beatrice's kitchen door with a jar of honey from his own bees that had no agricultural significance, but was given with such specific warmth that she kept the jar on the kitchen shelf for years. Eleanor was home from San Antonio for the occasion, 17 years old and brilliant and sharp as creek water, and she sat with her father after supper and talked about what she was learning with an intensity that was purely her mother in timbre and her father in content. Thomas managed the evening with a quiet, competent hospitality that was all his own. Henry fell asleep under the kitchen table at 9 o'clock, which was where Edgar found him when the evening began to wind down, and he picked the boy up and carried him to his bed with the ease of long practice. The guests left slowly, in the way of people who are reluctant to end a good evening. The new century was a few hours away, an abstraction that everyone was giving various degrees of significance. In the hill country of Texas, the turning of a century felt both very large and very ordinary, because the land had been here before any calendar and would be here after, and what mattered was whether the grass was good and the water was running, and the people you loved were in the same rooms with you. Beatrice stood at the cookhouse stove at 11:30 in the evening of December 31, 1899, alone for the first time all day, washing the last of the pots from the supper. The house had gone quiet. The children were in bed, the guests were gone, the stove was burning low. Edgar came to the cookhouse door. "Is there anything left?" he said. She turned and looked at him. He was 50 years old. She was 44. They had been married 17 years. Between them was every season they had been through, every hard winter and dry summer and good wet spring, every conversation at this table, Every evening he had been the last one in the room. Every second helping she had served with steady hands and a heart that had turned toward him the way a plant turns toward light, not by decision but by nature. "There is always something left," she said. She put the pot down and dried her hands and crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him, and he looked at her in the lamplight of the last night of the 19th century. "Happy New Year," he said quietly. "Not yet," she said. "Close enough," he said. He put his arms around her, there in the cookhouse that was hers and had always been hers, the room that smelled like the whole of their life together, like good bread and strong coffee and wood smoke, and the particular urban chilly complexity of her mother's cooking, translated through 30 years of a daughter's memory and 14 years of a wife's devotion. She stood in his arms and looked past his shoulder at the window where the Texas stars were brilliant and cold, and the new century was approximately 27 minutes away. She had said she would only cook for the season. She had meant it. She had been completely sincere. She had planned a careful, temporary, professionally bounded thing, and she had walked into it with her skillet and her terms and her independent heart. And he had eaten slowly, and asked for seconds, every single night. And she had stayed, not because she had been maneuvered or obligated or had run out of options. She had stayed because the season had turned out to be this: a life built at a stove and a table, made of food and conversation and children and seasons, and the slow, patient, daily choosing of each other. A season that had lasted 17 years and counting, and showed every sign of lasting 17 more and 17 beyond that, because the best things do not end, they only deepen. The new century arrived, and the mockingbird sang in the January dark, because mockingbirds do not keep hours, and the creek moved over its limestone, and the stars burned, and Beatrice Archer Ashford stood in her kitchen with her husband's arms around her and her own land 30 yards down the creek and her children asleep in the house she had made into a home. And she was exactly, precisely, completely where she intended to be. The next morning she made biscuits. Edgar sat at the end of the long kitchen table with the first light of the new century coming through the window, and he ate his breakfast with the full, careful attention he had always brought to her cooking, and when the plate was empty he looked up. "Beatrice," he said. "Yes," she said. "Would there be more?" She smiled, and it was not the contained, measured smile of a woman managing her expression. It was the full, open smile of a woman completely at home in her own life. "There will always be more," she said. And she served him seconds, and he ate them slowly. And the morning came up gold and clear over the Texas hill country, and the new century stretched ahead of them wide and open, and full of everything still to come.